Hi, and welcome to GameDay Essentials. I'm David Potes, and I have with me Joe Fontes today. And you're gonna see us talk quite a bit about changes. The original title of this episode was Changes, but I think we got a cease and desist letter from the original songwriter. So I'm David, and you can see my Twitter handle down there. Feel free to tweet weird things to me if you want to. But we'd prefer that you talk to us in the chat room. We wanted to be very chatty, and I promise to say your name, follow you, like whatever you want, as long as you come to the chat. I'm a solutions architect, which means I mostly tell people what to do without actually doing it. And we have Joe here. Joe, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. My name is Joe Fontes. I am also a solutions architect with Amazon Web Services. I have my Twitter handle up as well, which my wife says is not genuine, but not unique. But we came up with it together. I work with David here. You might notice that I am not Scott. I'll be subbing in for Scott today. Once again, the top choice behind the other four fellows. So pretty proud of that.
Yay, yeah, runner-up, the second prize in a beauty contest, right? Worth $10. Scott's at a disclosed location that we're not going to disclose to you, and Joe and I are in moderately disclosed locations. You can tell it's a cool place because we have coffee and walls and all that stuff. So, name of the game today is changes, right? And both, just like in real life, GameDay requires you to manage and deal with change. So we're going to spend some time talking about that today. How do you change your code? How do you change your systems? And what happens when something changes kind of out from under you? Want to give a shout out to Snow Cave. Thanks for the haha. Gina Clementi, one of our biggest fans. Love to see you in chat as well. But there's really kind of two kinds of changes that we deal with. And I kind of alluded to this previously, but we really want to spend some time, at least initially, talking about unanticipated change. And this can be something that goes wrong. This could be, your teammates, doing things with maybe not telling you. This could be bad guys. This could be adversaries, coming in and making changes. And, all of these things are quote unquote very bad things when you're not ready for it. But unfortunately, we live in an entropic world, full of entropy. Things are going to change. And how you plan for that is key for being able to react to that. Joe, you got any war stories about unanticipated changes? I've got one if you don't.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, throughout the years working in different environments. It's how do people react to these we'll call it non-optimal events, right? And so sometimes they could be pretty catastrophic. And really, you rely on what is it that you've done to prepare for these types of events. For instance, I remember we lost a database server once. This was a company many moons ago. We lost this database server, and I'm talking to the admin responsible for it, and I was like, well, we have secondaries, so let's just run through the process. Let's promote a secondary. I feel good about this. The regular one's not coming back, and that's when we found out that standard log shipping wasn't working, and backups were not functioning in the same manner as we had anticipated that they were. And it brought up all these independent issues where if there was one problem that took place, it would not have been catastrophic, but there was such a chain of events that happened. And realistically, it kind of forces you to take a look at what are the systems that we have in place that, keep these types of things from happening. Why was there no check on the status of the backup, whether or not the backup could even be restored? When was the last time we ran through a DR scenario? So that was my first week at the organization. So we ended up implementing some of those things.
Yeah, it's sometimes a trial by fire can be the best way to learn, but rarely is it kind of the least painful. So we've got unanticipated changes.
Kind of going off of the educational aspect here, the whole trial by fire, the whole concept of it, kind of the core of game day.
Right. Yeah. If I may mix my metaphors, you can kind of throw people in the deep end and see if they catch on fire, right? Giuliano, Christian, thanks for joining. I think before we really dive in to what we're going after, I just want to give you all a little background on what we're trying to do here. And for those of you that haven't, kind of religiously followed our previous episodes, well, first, shame on you, but they're on video. Really, the concept of this show, Game Day Essentials, is really an opportunity for us to spend some time talking about things that you might need to know if you want to play Game Day. And we have Game Day coming up next week in New York. It's Wednesday. Correct me if I'm wrong, Joe.
Yeah, please. And everyone, come join us, even if you just want to stop by to check it out. It's taking place at the AWS startup pop-up loft in New York. So even if you don't sign up for the event, if you just want to stop by, collect some swag, I'll make sure I at least have stickers available for anybody that wants to attend.
Yeah, and there should be free snacks too. So if you're an eater, definitely come by and check it out. I don't remember the address off the top of my head. It's somewhere in New York, right? Mapping software is a thing, so you can probably track it down.
How big can New York be? It's fine.
Yeah, exactly. I think
just show up somewhere in the state, and you'll just run into it. Just look for somebody in like a blue badge.
Yep, absolutely. And and you can watch previous episodes if you want to come up to speed. There's definitely some tips in there that you can use, and hopefully we'll throw a few more tips your way today. And we'll also be doing Game Day at reInvent. If you've never been to reInvent, prepare for mind blown, okay? Because it is insane. It's huge. It's full of learning opportunities, fun times. Apparently, Vegas has some sort of entertainment, so there's things to do. That'll be at the end of November. So last week of November, the week after Thanksgiving, you probably don't have anything planned then. So if you're not coming, definitely look into getting your tickets and come play Game Day with us in a massive air-conditioned tent.
We kind of covered this last week. Some of the differences between a reInvent size game day versus a summit versus smaller events like maybe the AWS pop-up loft or at different partner sites. But if you've attended a game day event at a summit, it's a whole different beast going into game day. At reInvent, it'll actually be a new game this year, as we do every year. So if you've thought about it, you've said, I went to San Francisco this year, so I've already done it. No, this is a whole new beast, as David said.
Yes, think of it as like, I don't want to say Super Bowl because that kind of undersells it. Think of like Galaxy Bowl. So definitely worth checking out. I want to jump in and start about talking. Go a little deeper on unanticipated changes. So I'm not going to steal our own thunder, but there are some game elements around this. So, if you're really picking up tips for gaming on Game Day, you're definitely going to want to pay attention to this. Joe, what do we do? Something's broken, something changed. First question is what changed, right? And, any tips for the new player or maybe the intermediate?
Sure. We all kind of have our personal preference of the way that we approach, systems deployment and checking out where logs are going, that type of thing. Prior to joining AWS, prior to really utilizing AWS, I had my same stack of tools that I kind of brought along to different companies that I worked for. And usually it was something like Nagios or Isinga to give me a heads up when something wasn't going the way that I had intended. It was, a mixture of, syslog ng or our syslog or, that manual kind of open source approach to centralized log collection, where I kind of ran through some scripts that I had just accumulated throughout the years that did my own style of analytics. And then, it's kind of, I've seen my process kind of evolve now that I've really kind of migrated everything I do over to AWS, I leverage the tools of AWS to really take advantage of not having to reinvent the wheel every time I start up a new stack deployment. One of the areas where we'll be looking at today, I don't know. So if we'd share my screen real quick, we can. I don't know. I'm not sure how that. I don't know. I'm not sure how that happens, but my screen will be up in a second. And this just kind of shows, a blog post that's been relatively recently published that showcases, one ability to push your application logs over to AWS CloudWatch logs. And wow, what a coincidence! I wrote that blog post. Is it me just trying to drive traffic to this to specific destination? I guess we'll never know. But this is one example that kind of highlights, how you can integrate AWS CloudWatch logs in with an application. So when you think of, a lot of times when you think of logging, you think of, what goes over to var log messages or dmessage, or maybe the output of your Cisco devices, getting that to centralized logging location. But it's also your applications. It's not always a server issue, an entire server issue that's going to bring down your applications. It's, you've got to sift through your Java logs, you got to sift through your application logs, your PHP, your Python, whatever it is that you're utilizing, your Microsoft event logs, they need to be sent through to a centralized location, because a lot of times you'll notice that there's small issues that take place, and these are the ones that you want to grab quickly. If you have a single web server that goes down, you have users with their session tied to that web server, and if it's not a hard down, if that server is not being taken out of the rotation, all that session data is still tied to that server, and you're really going to interrupt the end user experience. And so, yeah, this is kind of one of those areas, like the unanticipated issues that kind of pop up. That's kind of a large part of every systems administrator, network engineering, systems engineering. A large part of time is spent to kind of mitigate against those issues. But, step one, as Dave stated, is really, identifying what are the issues and getting that information as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and I think that we've all kind of evolved. I think over time, especially the older folks around here, and I think many of us started with tools like the not far from kind of homegrown DIY setups, and I know that my approach has evolved, and I've used a number of tools in my lackluster career. And I do have a poll. I'm really curious about folks watching. What are you using for log management? So I put together a little poll. I'm going to throw it up in the chat. I'll give you a few minutes to answer it, and we'll kind of look back and see what people are using. I know that I've built a number of systems with CloudWatch logs, which great tool, and gives you the ability to do that aggregation. When you think about it, there's kind of three kind of basic things that you want to do with logs, right? You want to have a tool for ingest, right? So the open source version would be Logstash, and something that you can use to basically fire those logs into a centralized repository, like Joe said. And then you'll need something to index them. So that could be something like Elasticsearch or a Splunk or a Datadog, or even homegrown databases. And nothing's complete without pretty pictures, right? Line graphs and bar charts and all that good stuff. So there's a number of visualization tools out there that folks use. Now, if you're using a commercial solution, like a Splunk or a Sumo Logic, all of those things are going to be together, right? So it's kind of the whole package. Whereas, if you're using something more like what we call the Elk stack, that's Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana, even though they kind of work all together, they're separate parts. And because they're kind of somewhat distinct applications, there's definitely some challenges there back in my Elk days. Joe, what do you recommend today for logging? What's good?
So it's kind of amusing too, because as I'm listening to you describe the elk stack, every once in a while I feel like I show my technology age, right? I don't know if syslog ng is as prevalent as it used to be. I'd be curious if anybody that's watching right now is using syslog ng, but that used to be the pretty de facto standard. Yes, I switched over to elk before I switched over to other solutions, but I really always loved that Kibana interface. It shows the logs, the trends in a way that I always wanted to do with my custom projects, but was never really able to spend the time and implement. It had some simple chart.js, but it never quite looked as nice as Kibana, never operated quite as seamless, and it certainly doesn't compare to CloudWatch logs. But considering we are part of the AWS Partner Network, we do spend a lot of time working with the partner products, and we spend a lot of time interacting with the partners. And one of the things I really love about partners like Datadog, Splunk, Loggly is a lot of that decision making, the pre-built analytics, the ability to recognize what is out of the norm. If I ship them all of my, var log messages, I'm not going to get a lot of false positives because it's probably something that they've dealt with before. And so rather than, spending the first part of my day, checking off boxes saying, oh, that's fine, you get a lot more data that's pertinent to what you're working on.
Yeah, and I think, we've kind of talked about general log aggregation here, and we'd probably be remiss if we didn't talk about kind of a couple of the categories of logs. And, we're using a catch-all term of logs here, but often we'll talk about logs and metrics. So metrics would be, CPU usage or networking usage, whereas logs are, wrote this file or, this hacker deleted this file or that sort of thing. And I think, if we kind of ground things back in the game, if there are changes, probably one of the first places that you want to look is with CloudTrail. CloudTrail, one of my favorite services, dead simple in description, but interesting in application, right? So basically CloudTrail is going to be a log of all of the commands that are run against your AWS account. And, fun fact is that these are all the API calls, and even the console is built on a series of API calls. So whether you're going through the CLI, i.e. the command line interface, or the console, or you're using an SDK or some other tool, all of those changes are going to go into CloudTrail. So if you've ever wondered, somebody messing with my account, and if they're using some sort of credentialed access, all of that is going to be in CloudTrail. Now, for folks that are trying this at home, you do need to turn CloudTrail on. It doesn't come turned on out of the box. So that's one of the first things that I always tell people to do. Go directly to CloudTrail. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200 until you've turned that on. So that's really important to do so you can kind of see if somebody's making changes. If you have a rogue network admin, or somebody's stolen some credentials and you're wondering what changed, that's a great place to look. Now CloudTrail, not a fun place to try to read these as a human. Typically you're going to want to use some sort of aggregation tool, and it doesn't necessarily have to be fancy if you just want to get started. You could always dump those into a rows and columns type tool. And that's a great way to do it. So CloudTrail, log source number one. I think there's another interesting blog post up on the screen. Joe, do you want to talk about what you're showing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in addition to CloudTrail, a popular solution is also AWS Config. And so we have this ability to find out exactly what's running in our account and to stream those changes up to a centralized, up to S3, and we can perform actions based upon when we find changes. But one of the cool, relatively new features, I guess, is Cloud Config rules. And so, an example rule would be, let's say you have a developer group, a developer department. They should only be testing on T-series instances. You can kick off like some kind of alert to take place if the instance type is larger than a T-series. And so, that gives you that real-time responses to, kind of known events where you could build the rules around it. And yeah, so here we have a slightly older blog post, but this is automating the deployment of AWS config using the PHP SDK. And so, yeah, it turns out, whoa, I can't believe I wrote this one too. And so if anybody wants to check it out, it's a little bit dated, but we like to get some readers on our blog posts.
Yeah, and this is probably where I make a joke about PHP. So maybe a little bit dated, but so is PHP. Drum riff, please. And I love your name. Shout out, I'm going to say Holy Fook, because it's F-U-K. So questions from the chat. They said, my org had a dev that said we need nothing but grep. Would you bet your infrastructure on grep, Joe?
So it used to be, remember, there were big arguments. There was this, are you using grep, fgrep, egrep? This is one of those tools. It's kind of like, why do we trust the trapdoor function of RSA? Because, it's something that, mathematicians have been trying to get around for a very long time, the idea of solving primes easily. And I kind of feel like, sed, awk, and grep kind of fit into that same category to where, they've really stood the test of time. I've seen huge data workloads that are still using, sed, awk, and grep. You got to get a little bit creative to find the performance enhancements. But yeah, I can say that there's probably at least one organization that's trusting lives of people to, sed, awk, and grep.
Wow. Okay. Do let me know offline what that organization is so I can kind of run away screaming. I think, my biggest criticism of that approach, and, I threw this up in the chat, is those tools are great for parsing, but not so great if you're trying to do statistical anomalies, right? So how do you find, outliers or, things that are a couple of standard deviations away? Like that can get actually pretty complicated with those tools. I do want to give a shout out to the poll. Thank you to the thousands of people that answered. So what do you use for log management in AWS? And number one answer is CloudWatch Logs, with over half of the respondents saying that they use that. Great. It's an easy service to use. If you haven't had a chance, definitely check it out. One person answered there are logs. Thank you for that. Yes, there are. We've got an elk lover and a Datadog lover out there, and nobody's shouting out for DIY. This is a safe space. If you want to say that you've built DIY logs, we're okay here. We can be cool about it.
So have I shown my age with syslog-ng? Is that what happened? Not one response?
Yeah, no, maybe. Your poll creator didn't help you much either. I didn't put that as an option. Next time I'll dig out some ancient things, something with punch cards or something like that. So I just I want to pause here. Some folks may have joined us late. Totally understand. I'm typically running late too. Just let you know what we're doing today. You're watching GameDay Essentials. Your ramp to learning how to play GameDay better, and hopefully, learning about a few services and products that might help you along your way. So thanks for joining. Meet us in the chat. A shout out to Zibaban. I don't know what that icon says, but it's pretty cool. Joe, what about anticipated change?
So, especially during an event like GameDay, where you're really allowed to just play around with, what are your solutions to, how you're deploying software or how you're scaling. It's really important that you not only test the anticipated changes within an organization, but that you kind of retest it every once in a while, make sure that things work as planned. And so what do we think of as far as anticipated changes? So as we mentioned, scaling decisions is a big one, system deployments, and probably on the regular, software deployments. If we're looking at a web application stack, something that's publicly available, we're going to need to push out code updates, and maybe it's something as simple as a UI update for some JavaScript library, or it's much more functionality related. Whatever it is, we want to be able to ensure that all of that functionality is working, as we roll out the solution. And that's kind of a tough place to get, right? We've all heard the terminology CI/CD, the continuous integration, continuous deployment, but it's a really tough place to get to when you can just without worrying, without biting your nails, check something into your production repository, have it push all the way through dev test stage, run unit tests, and then be okay for production. And so that's a really big chasm to leap over. And so it's really tough to kind of get to that end phase where you can just say, all right, I'm good with this going straight to production. For those that don't develop on production, because that definitely never happens. But kind of getting to that end point, it's how do we're going to kind of focus on some methodologies a little bit later on helping to get to that end point. But really, it's what do we use in order to enable that? And there's a lot of different tools, and we see a lot of solutions at GameDay, some more custom, some with more AWS driven, like AWS auto scaling. We covered an auto scaling and launch configuration deployment during the last episode, there's a ton of other solutions. We'll be looking a little bit at like Elastic Beanstalk and ECS, pushing solutions out and updates via container updates. So there's a lot of possibilities there. It's kind of what's your personal preference?
Well, is it just? I think you forgot one step too in that pipeline. The system administrators need to be sitting around drinking Mai Tais. If you can get everything automated, then it's time for some tropical drinks. But on the serious tip, Joe, like how do you decide? I feel like there's a ton of different deployment options out there. There's as many different deployment options as there are administrators, right? And one of the ones that I get a lot of questions about, and I talk a lot about, is Elastic Beanstalk. It seems too easy, but it's a heck of an application. What's going on the back end when we kind of fire up Beanstalk, and what makes it great?
Yeah. So what did you know? We have another blog post example up on the screen. I guess that's crazy. It just happens to be one that I wrote as well. But this is an example here of integrating code deploy with a partner solution of Solano Labs. They're a CI/CD provider in the AWS Partner Network in order to deploy Elastic Beanstalk applications. This is, Elastic Beanstalk kind of takes out the necessity to make a lot of decisions that maybe aren't well understood or are just fine with whatever the default is. So, for instance, if I want to deploy, let's say I come up with my custom application and I put it in a Docker container, I could actually deploy that via Elastic Beanstalk, and Elastic Beanstalk will identify when scaling decisions need to be made. It'll decide if this application is no longer responsive. It'll help fail it over. So it goes ahead and works with auto scaling. It works with load balancing in order to ensure the availability of an application. And it really kind of I think it's a really nice way to initiate yourself into application scalability. Here we have an example. This is so if you ever want to try out Elastic Beanstalk, it actually comes with a demo application that you can deploy. There are multiple different languages that you can utilize for your demo application. So we've deployed one of the demo applications. I think this is on PHP 7. And this is the overview of what it looks like once it has deployed. So you've got your URL over here. This is the public endpoint for your Elastic Beanstalk web application. And here are your logs of here's everything that's happened thus far to get us into a running state. And so what's really cool is, all you've done is interacted with the AWS console at this point, and you have a fully functional, auto-scaling, highly available, multi-AZ web application just working through the GUI console. And you're still using your code base. Not for the demo, obviously, but when you do a regular AWS Elastic Beanstalk deployment, you're using your code base, whether that's something programming language specific. So if your application is written in PHP, you choose the PHP container. If it's Node.js, you choose the Node.js application. You choose the programming language, and then just ensure that Elastic Beanstalk is able to get to your code. You host it up on your own S3 bucket, make sure that it's private, it's secure, allow S3 Elastic Beanstalk access, and then Elastic Beanstalk takes care of the process of just deploying that entire process, that entire web application. And so that blog post that I highlighted is, you have your web application up and running, everything's happy. You want to perform a code update on that running web application. What does that process look like? And so that goes through one opportunity for that process, and that's using, Code Deploy, Solano Labs, but it could just as easily be another partner solution like Circle CI or CodeShip, or it could just be an entirely AWS-driven stack. If you want to use AWS Code Commit for your repository, if you want to use GitHub for your repository, you could use AWS Code Pipeline in order to enable that push, that notification of code updates. You can use S3. Really, it's all about enabling innovation on the platform. And that's why we have such a huge population of ecosystem partners, is because the goal here is to build a platform that others can leverage to build some really cool, innovative solutions.
Okay, great. So Beanstalk, it does run things other than PHP.
I've heard. That's a rumor.
Yeah, I hear there's other languages out there. So, PHP, Java, Python, Ruby, Node, .NET, Go, or a Docker app.
If you write your own application in C and you put it into a Docker container, you could have Elastic Beanstalk handle that Docker container deployment. So, if you wrote an assembly application, that would run an Elastic Beanstalk. So it's kind of, enabling, whatever it is that you need to deploy on that solution.
Sweet. So Fortran, right? That'll be a lot of fun too.
I've never tested it, but I can tell you that it runs mumps.
Fun fact.
Yes, fun fact. For all you mumps devs out there, yes, Elastic Beanstalk will pull it off.
So I've got another poll for everybody. So I'm going to throw this up in the chat. Promise to keep making dad jokes in the chat too. Curious, what are folks out there using to deploy software code to AWS? I presume that all of your applications are on AWS, but let me know. One of the options on the poll is SSH into boxes, UG. So I know that it's probably not the most fun choice to be able to do that, but there's probably scenarios, you're testing something, there's one box, and you may be presented with machines where you don't have an SSH key. Say that was kind of thrown at me, Joe, how would you approach kind of the SSH manualization piece?
Yeah, absolutely. I've always said that I could be replaced by a well-designed shell script at any time, and so I guess we could walk through how to do that, not to give anybody ideas. So we have some instances here that have been launched previously, that I've launched specifically for this example. And you'll notice right down here we have an empty key pair name. So this instance here, maybe this is running an application that's really important to us. Maybe this is just part of an auto-scaling group. Whatever it is, right now we don't have the ability to get into this box. So whatever it's running is operating as a bit of a black box at the moment. And this is not an uncommon scenario. Whether instances were previously launched without a key, or maybe they were launched by another vendor, or part of a different CloudFormation stack. Whatever the reason is, not wholly uncommon. So one of the processes that we have for gaining access to these is first we need to ensure that we have a key pair created, which would be done through the EC2 console under key pairs. This can also be done via the various SDKs, via the command line, and other solutions. But just ensure that you have a key pair. If you don't have one at all and you launch an instance, you'll have to select, launch it without a key pair. And that's kind of what got us into this mess in the first place, right? So we have this instance, it's off running. We can't SSH into it if it's, if it needs a software update, no matter what it is. But what if we don't actually have access to the contents of that machine? So this is running an application that somebody developed a while back. It was a fix and forget. I have no idea where this code base is. Kind of step one would be to take a snapshot or build a new image based upon this running instance. And what that does is it gives you the ability to launch a similar instance, a copy of this instance, except the next time attach a key pair to it so that we can SSH into it. And so that we don't have to sit around and wait for me to actually do that. We've already done that. So our running instance is over here. And what we see is, and so what we see is it looks like a standard AWS AMI that's been deployed. And so this is kind of like the starting off building block of what is it that we want to do with a blank instance. If this had been populated with an application that was essential, we'd have to make sure, is it actually running at the moment? Is it not running? Or we'd have to start it up. So it'd be like we just rebooted the one that was the older instance. So if that needs to have a web server start or an application start, that needs to be done now. But we have access to this box once we associate that key with the running instance. And then, so now we've got our key associated with it. Where do we take it from here? So let's say that the second that you have a brand new instance deployment, there's a few tasks that you need to do. So step one is you got to make sure that web server is installed. Step two is you need your actual you need your index page up and running. And then you need to actually start the web server. There we go. So I just completed 3 tasks manually right now. So I installed the Apache web server, I created an index page, and then I started up the web server. So let's say that you need to deploy 10 more servers like this. One of the options would be to create a shell script, from a centralized location, and that would, as soon as a new instance is created, just run this shell script across all of these instances. And kind of the downside to that is you have to actually track these instances. Which instance, that just started up has had this shell script run across it. You've kind of got that central point of failure, and it really doesn't scale well. Maybe this operates when you have 10 instances or even 20, which I think is pushing it. But what about when you get up to large scales? If you have to launch 10,000 instances, you can't have one location just SSHing onto individual boxes to get all these tasks completed, even something as simple as that. And so that's where we get into the concept of, user data, launch configurations, tying those to auto-scaling groups so that every time a new instance starts, those specific commands can be run. Alternatively, if you don't even want to do that, right now this instance here would technically be ready for production deployment, since it has our services started and it has our web application, which is our index.html. Since it already has that installed, we could technically just take a snapshot of this box, set this in our launch configuration to just keep launching new versions of this, which sounds good initially until you realize this instance is going to get pretty stale at some point. It's going to need updates run against it. And so every time you launch a new one, it's going to do maybe, you have one script that says, just yum update or apt-get update. But that needs to be run every time. Sometimes, initially it's going to be, it only has 3 packages to install. A year from now, that's a 15, 20-minute startup process.
So you mentioned launch config and user data, and I know we addressed that a little deeper in episode 2, but any hot tips for folks using that, or anything that we want to kind of double underscore?
Sure. It's ensuring that you're up to date with your auto scaling groups and launch configurations. One of the things that we covered last week is creating auto scaling decisions. So, at what point do we want to scale up versus at what point do we want to auto scale down? And those, I think, are kind of a little bit of moving targets, right? We just reduced the amount of time that it takes to initiate an auto scaling decision. So we're always going to have changes there. Remember, it used to be it was only 5 minutes, and then 1 minute increments were introduced as an option. And so that time it is changing. Our opportunities are changing with something like CloudWatch. We could create new alarms that might give us a heads up that we need to scale up at a faster interval. Instead of waiting for the CPU of instances to get to a certain point, maybe we talk about, what's the latency of the web application? And then, after that, it's, what's the latency that we're seeing on DNS resolution? What are the health checks associated with Route 53? And so I would say just to keep fine tuning that, it's what I refer to as what we all refer to as kind of a living document. It's a living configuration. There's always going to be tweaks. And the more you tweak that to fit the needs of your organization, the better the user experience is going to be, the more frugal you're going to be in your deployments, and the less resources, unnecessary resources that you'll consume. What about you, Dave? Any good examples from historical deployments?
Yeah, I had a time when we were trying to implement blue-green deployments, and I know we'll touch on this a little later. And we just kept, deploying the same old code to each stack and promoting it. And it wasn't different, and we promoted it. It wasn't different. We went through probably 3 or 4 of those before we kind of figured out what was going on. This is our first time out on this, and it was 50% face palm and 50% I want to go hide under my desk. That was a long day, but we figured it out. And like you said, living document. These things are a journey, right? It takes a while to get your auto scaling right, and I'm going to use some sysadmin weasel words. I'm going to say your mileage may vary, right? Because you do have to take the time to understand what's good for your environment. And this comes up in GameDay. Auto scaling rules, launch configs is probably one of the most common questions that we get. So do spend the time to take a look at that and really understand, desired configuration, min-max, and what you're scaling on, just like Joe said. I do want to take a brief pause while Joe shows the run book on the Twitch feed. We are here at GameDay Essentials. I'm Dave. Joe's on the other side of my undisclosed link. He's in a secure location. And what we're really trying to do here is give you the knowledge that you need to totally succeed at GameDay. So that's the gist of the show. This is episode 3, so there's 2 previous ones to check out. And do come see GameDay next Wednesday in New York, or at reInvent in November. So I do want to talk about the poll a little bit. We essentially have a 5-way tie. So Homegrown scripts are hot. Chef, Puppet, Ansible, Salt, OpsWorks is hot. One Porcel SSHs into boxes. May God have mercy on your soul. CloudFormation / Terraform got a shout out. Kind of put those together because they're similar constructs. And then something else, and I think Eric Briscoe, shout out Eric, says he's using Jenkins plus Ansible, but he's saying maybe run commands someday. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't spend some time talking about CloudFormation, and there are mad features that have come out for CloudFormation over the last 6 months. So if you haven't looked at it in a while, you should definitely take a look. Joe, what's hot in CFN?
Sure. So I'm showing a blog post right now. This one is not one of mine.
What?
Yeah, I know. You'll notice that it's slightly better written. But yeah, so this one, this is a blog post by Jeff Barr, and it kind of outlines one of the changes that we've seen in CloudFormation, something referred to as stack sets. And there's been a lot of new features added to stack sets in particular, and a lot of new capabilities that really surface around AWS CloudFormation. Another example we have here somewhere is SAM. So it's the AWS Serverless Application Model. And so, kind of looking at, what are stack sets. So we're, initially with something like AWS CloudFormation, we put the entire deployment typically into one CloudFormation template. From there, the next evolution was let's break this up into multiple CloudFormation templates. So we'd have, a primary CloudFormation template, and then it would kick off additional CloudFormation templates that were stored off in S3. And now we have something, with this new capability of CloudFormation stack sets, where we kind of break up the infrastructure into the individual sets or units. So, if you have your web servers that are part of one stack, and you have database servers as part of another, or just your entire LAMP stack or WAMP stack or whatever it is that you want to do as a part of one stack, and other infrastructure as a part of another. It's all about breaking that up so that you can really manage that a little bit better. And this also applies to running AWS serverless infrastructure. So if you're running a web application, maybe you designed with API gateway, with dynamic capabilities built in AWS Lambda, you can now automate that deployment through the serverless application model. And what you'll notice is if you read about SAM maybe a few months ago, you wanted to get started. Since the first announcement, there's been a ton of new material that's been posted for examples on AWS Labs. For those of you that may not be familiar,
I'll throw it up in the chat.
Oh, okay. So we have a bunch of repositories available that kind of showcase example deployments. And I saw that there were quite a few new repositories published here that showcase how to use the serverless application model, which leverages AWS CloudFormation in the back end to be able to publish all of these updates. So it's really interesting. You put your configuration for something like Lambda API Gateway in a Swagger configuration. You then kind of compile it into the examples are here, but you kind of compile it into your CloudFormation template that says, the Lambda functions are here. Here's the location of your API Gateway configuration, and as soon as you go for update, it updates that entire stack with any of those requested modifications. So you could put this right into a CI/CD pipeline with something like Jenkins or Code Pipeline to be able to make a change in your configuration, especially in something like dev, check it in, and then have it automatically deployed with SAM, such that any integration updates down the line with API Gateway, with Lambda, with any other service configuration offerings are all pushed up through CloudFormation. And so it's really cool just how ingrained CloudFormation is becoming in the process flow of all the additional services.
Yeah, and I think definitely check out Sam. The logo is pretty hilarious. It's a squirrel, so clearly we're onto something here. And we've been talking about serverless for years now. I don't know if it's a hot new thing anymore, but definitely there's a lot of hotness there. And the advantages are manifest. You have the ability to really, really, really only pay for what you use. So Lambda allow you to pay by executions, and if I remember correctly, the first million are free, which is a pretty decent number of executions. And the challenge was how do we deploy to this? And there are some tools out there. There's something called Jaws at one point, and I know he got a cease and desist letter. Turns out there's a movie called Jaws. But that kind of set the stage for these new tooling sets. And SAM is a very cool way to approach that. And I have our third poll today. Really curious about your approach to how you do serverless. So if you're doing it, or if not, how are you deploying? How are you managing that? Curious your approach. So go ahead and jump in the poll when you get a chance. David Orlando 65, I assume that's what MCO is. So he had a question. He's asking about changing API definitions in the code. And what he's asking is, if you add a new resource in your code, you also have to add it in the SAM file, no? What do you think, Joe?
So it depends. So for instance, one of the examples is that's available on the repository is implementing, I think this was the Twilio example, but the idea is that you have your, this was written in Python, I believe. So you've got your Python code that's off in its own kind of area where you can make your updates to Python, you can test it, and then when you go for a new deploy, it'll update the, as long as you check it into your repository, it still requires that you go through your own CI/CD process. So let's say, for instance, that you just have a code-based deployment. You probably don't have to use you still have to use SAM through that deployment process. So it'll bring up all the code, wrap it up together into an archive, and then bring that up with the CloudFormation update, because all of the Lambda functions in the back end, they have to be updated with the new code. So that's not something that has to be updated in the Swagger file, but still has to be pushed up via the CloudFormation update. Okay,
cool. Totally makes sense. So I think we kind of touched on this before. Some cool stuff about Docker. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't at least mention ECS. But at the same time, we could probably do a whole series on containers. So Chris Hine or Brandon, if you're listening, I'm coming for you. But ECS, if you're not familiar with it, it's our own container service. It works really well too. So you're able to containerize things to run applications, and this comes up in the game too. I've seen a number of teams use an approach where they're trying to do things on containers because when you're playing GameDay, one of the elements is how much traffic can you serve at the lowest cost. And doing containers gives you the ability to basically, it's the world's largest bin packing algorithm, right? So we're bin packing these apps onto ECS containers. So PL and SF said ECS is kind of hard to set up. I feel you. Container systems in general are not the simplest things, but if you have specific feedback on what could be easier, we'd love to hear it. So
Dave,
let me know.
If only there was some form of document or blog post per se that could walk you through this process of deploying a brand new ECS application. What? That's right. I actually have a blog post associated with that.
Yeah. Do we have any other bloggers besides this Joe Fontes guy?
Hey, I'm looking to break into the double digits for readership, so
Nice.
I gotta start pushing these.
Yeah, no, that's cool.
Yeah.
So the other thing PL and SF did said was that he's planning to use serverless deployment for his private projects because it seems more affordable and straight up. We do a workshop where the entire workshop cost is measured in pennies. Serverless is great there. Take a look at the case study we have on bustle.com. So they built it's essentially a lifestyle site for millennial women, and they serve millions of users a month, and it's all running on a serverless architecture. So that's a very cool one too. I don't want to leave code deploy out. Joe, any feedback on using code deploy? Like, when should we use it?
Oh, yeah, sure. So when we're looking at code deploy, it's I'm trying to think. Hold on, I think I have. Do I have a? Here we go. Look at this, another blog post with code deploy as the example. Wow, it's a miracle. What I always liked about code deploy was that it really simplified this concept of the blue-green deployment, or some refer to as the red-black deployment. It kind of simplifies that approach right in the GUI interface that you utilize in order to deploy it. And, it takes the approach of, do you want to do this deployment one instance at a time? We're talking about pushing code updates to your, dev test production environments in an automated fashion. And so the question is, do you want to do this one instance at a time? Do you want to do like 50% of your instances at a time? Or do you just want to go completely in and just say, do it all as fast as possible? It kind of gives you that ability to say, we're going to test this out. Even though it's gone past unit testing and QA, we're going to still, do a rolling release within production. It's interesting. I was presenting at Jenkins user conference, and I kind of had all these slides dedicated to, the red, black, blue, green deployment. And afterwards, some attendees came up and they said, like red, black deployment, like I hadn't heard of that before. I'd really encourage you. Netflix has a great set of series that they've done on blog posts of their implementation of the blue-green style deployment, which they've kind of referenced as the red-black deployment. And so it gives you another implementation, another style to look at. They've built a lot of really cool tools. We reference them often. They're a great partner. And so, if you ever get a chance, also read through the things that they've done, with the different tools that they've built in order to be able to test, not only will this application not fall over in production, but it'll handle all the load and all the nuances associated with their application and their platform.
Yeah, and Netflix open sourced their one of their tools called Spinnaker. So I don't know if you've tried it out, but we did do a quick